So, for those of you that don't know, we recently went through an acquisition earlier this year and we acquired a company called Wrike, which they basically do collaborative work management. And just like us, we have a lot of our customers that go through mergers and acquisitions constantly.
Yeah, and I think like the Wrike acquisition, and everyone was excited to hear about all the benefits to come. But then as soon as the ink dried with legal, every department had to get into gear to figure out how to make these synergies work, particularly IT. How are they going to access each other's systems, and how are they going to authenticate with different directories?
Yeah, for sure. And when you take into account, like, there's always this transition period, right? It's like one thing is signing the paperwork, but there's always this transition period that you have to go through to get employees from one company resources to the access to the resources to the other company. And I think that can be very challenging for IT, right? Because you need to make sure that the end users are productive, but from a security perspective, make sure that, things are still secure. At least while you're transitioning all of this, try to figure out what's going on.
Right, and it takes time, but as IT is definitely under pressure to make that time as short as possible. Fortunately, Citrix is great at this. We have great technology and solutions to help with these mergers and acquisitions, and we've been doing it for like the largest customers in the world for a long time.
Yeah, for sure. And for that, we have invited two guests for this one. I guess one will talk about mergers and the other on acquisitions, or we'll see how they split it up. But they'll talk about how exactly Citrix can be used during a merger and acquisition period. And so we have invited Dan Feller, who he's usually hosting these events, and now he's on as one of our guests. And we've also invited Brian Olsen as our other guest. So welcome, guys, to Texan Live.
Hi, everybody.
Thanks for having me, Anna.
Of course.
So the mergers and acquisitions is an interesting topic, and Brian and I are going to kind of share and swap back and forth on how this is done. But we want to really start with is just this initial conceptual architecture of what is it that we're trying to build, and then we'll show a demo. Then we'll go into more of the details of how this thing was done. So, as Anna and Matt, you guys are talking about, mergers and acquisitions, one company is acquiring or merging with another company. This can happen multiple times. So what you end up having is that you have different users from these different companies, and they all have access to different resources from within their own company. And to get access to those resources, chances are they're on different identity providers. It could be Okta, it could be Active Directory, and if multiple of them are Active Directory, they're on different Active Directory domains that aren't trusted because up until the acquisition or merger, they were completely separate companies. So these are completely separate environments that we had to try to integrate. So what we end up doing is we utilize Workspace to consolidate and integrate all these different resource feeds and identity providers together. So a user from any company hits Workspace, they authenticate through their primary identity provider, the ones they were using before the acquisition. Workspace then will take that identity and then translate that to all the different resources to see what is this user authorized to access. And that could be SaaS and web applications through the secure Workspace access service, or it could be virtual apps and desktops through the virtual apps and desktop service. So that is a very high level of the overall architecture of this solution. So what I want to do is show you a fairly quick demo. And so with the demo, this is recorded because I want to be able to show side by side, and I'm not that good to control two machines at the same time. But what you see is user company A and company B, and they're both going to access the exact same Workspace URL. And so the first thing that happens here, when they select sign in, they're going to be asked, hey, which company, which organization are you from, A or B? And depending on what you pick, Workspace is going to authenticate them to a different identity provider. Company A is going to Okta, Company B is going to an internal Active Directory domain. And Company B didn't have any, multi-factor authentication, so we're able to incorporate, a 6-digit passcode. Now, once they log in, what you end up seeing is they actually have a different experience here. There's this policy-based branding where you get a different look and feel, different colors, different logos. you also have the contextual authorization for the different resources. So you can see user A has a lot of different apps than user B. Now, if they access the same application, what ends up happening here is we're applying different security policies based on these user identities. So now you have this contextual access within the application. By contextual access, we mean this user can do copy, paste, print, downloads, while the other user cannot. So a company B user is accessing a company A app. They can access it, but they can't copy and download and print content. The last part of this is we're going to move into the virtual app and desktop perspective on this. So we're going to see is basically the same thing. They're accessing a Windows desktop running in company A, and you can see the watermarks for the different users. So you can see company B and company A. They're accessing the same resource, but they have access to different drives. It's one way we can show how they have contextual access within there. And then the last thing to show is with the analytics portion of this. So when we go into analytics, what we end up seeing is that the user started doing something. The user started doing something that was a different behavior, and so what ends up happening is analytics is identifying this anomalous activity, and because the risk level is so high, we've actually set a policy that if the risk level goes high, we want to automatically log this user off. And so that's what we end up seeing here is this user was disconnected from that session to try to protect the environment because they're doing something that they haven't really done before that's different than their normal behavior. So that's kind of how we're looking at how you handle a merger and acquisition within Workspace. And a lot of this intelligence comes down to what we call multi-factor authentication or n-factor authentication. And getting into that, I actually want to hand this over to Brian to explain how all this stuff works behind the scenes.
Thanks, Dan. So let's talk about the solution and how it works. First, we're going to start off with the Citrix Application Delivery Controller. I'm just going to call it the ADC. You may know it as its former name of NetScaler. Now, the ADC can do a variety of things that we're going to take advantage of. One is we can connect to multiple identity providers, all the big ones that you know and are familiar with, as well as a variety of others. We also can build out interesting user experiences to tie in multi-factor authentication with a variety of partners. Now, for the example of Company A and Company B, we're going to build out an authentication virtual server, and this is where we're going to build that dropdown. So the first dropdown is going to be Company A, and we're going to build out a SAML policy because we're using Okta as the identity provider. For Company B, on that dropdown, we're going to have a regular LDAP policy that's going to talk to Active Directory. And because Company B wants to elevate its security, we're going to use the built-in ADC time-based one-time password policy. So this would be the kind of thing where you can type in a code you get on your phone and have that second factor to continue the authentication. Now on the back end, we're going to integrate everything to Company A's Active Directory using FAS. And let's talk about what FAS is next. So FAS stands for Federated Authentication Service, and it solves a problem that we have anytime we use a non-Active Directory authentication mechanism. So let's talk about a typical workload login. So the employee goes out to Workspace, the identity broker microservice is going to prompt them for credentials, they're going to log in, then Workspace is going to pass that authentication through to Active Directory. This is what you're probably familiar with a traditional Citrix login. Now, in the case of Company B that's using Okta, we need to handle the connection between that Okta identity and the Active Directory from Company A. Okay, for Company B, we're going to be logging in through Okta, and we need something to connect that Okta identity with the Active Directory from Company A. And that is where FAS comes in. So when the user goes and logs in, we're going to actually, instead of doing the normal pass-through, we're going to use the virtual smart card to log the user in on that backend Active Directory. And we can dig into this in a little bit more detail next. So in this example, we're going to have your traditional on-premises IT managed data center, and it's going to have a couple of cloud connectors in it, and they're going to be talking to Workspace. Now we're also going to have an on-premises FAS service set up, and that's going to talk to the FAS microservice. And then we need to make sure that we're having Active Directory sync to our identity provider. So when the user logs into Workspace, the identity broker microservice is going to reach out to the identity provider and authenticate the user. It's then going to pass that on to the virtual apps and desktop service. And at this point, the user will see all their apps and desktops. And when a user goes to click on one of those apps or desktops, this is where the Workspace is going to reach out to the FAS microservice. It's going to talk to FAS, who is going to go and talk to the certificate service and say, hey, we need a smart card. At this point, when the user goes to connect to their virtual desktop, FAS is going to map that identity from the identity provider to that smart card and log the user in. While this may look a little bit complicated on this diagram, this all happens in an instance, and it's much like a normal Windows logon where you single sign on all the way through to the desktop.
And I think one thing that's important to note is that, when you're merging a company, you don't want to disrupt the end users, right? So if they're used to logging in through Okta and then company B has a different way of logging in, it was really cool to see that they're still able to maintain that and that you're not disrupting from the end user standpoint, what they're used to.
Yeah, and I think sometimes companies tend to skimp on security for speed of implementation, but in this case, maintain full multi-factor authentication and analytics, monitoring security throughout the session while the user still has a good experience.
Yeah, because the first part on when the merger or acquisition actually happens, it's going to take a long time for IT to merge all those systems. So you want to start working together as from two separate companies to one organization, and you can't do that when you're all based on different identities. So now IT is either scrambling, trying to create thousands of new accounts in the main identity, or you can use something like this and users keep working like they do, and you just translate a company B identity to company A, via like a UPN, some common parameter that can link these accounts together, and then they can get access to, company B users can get access to company A apps, and start working together much easier.
No, that's awesome. That's great.
And then, so this whole thing actually came about because, Brian, you actually had when you talked to me about it, this was based on a customer that you've been working with who wanted basically a repeatable process to, keep acquiring and keep merging in new organizations. And this is basically the solution you were able to come up with.
Yeah, that's true. I work with big enterprise accounts. Mergers and acquisitions are an everyday occurrence. And I worked with one of my customers who came to us and said, we have this mandate to make sure that company B has multi-factor authentication, and we want to make sure that we can make this the most seamless user experience possible while still checking all of our security requirements.
No, I think that's great, Brian, and especially from like an authentication perspective, right? It seems like company B may have not had such strong requirements, and then when they joined company A, it was really cool to see that just with the ADC, they were able to turn on a second factor of authentication without any additional work or additional technology needed.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we talked to the business about the solution, the thing that everyone really liked is that, number one, it's really easy to use. Everyone's going to know which company they work for. That drop-down box makes it real simple, because we know the users might have a opportunity to access resources at either company, depending on the day. This really puts them in charge. And then on the backside, the security teams and just general IT were very excited to have a solution that not only handled company B's challenges, but we know there's going to be a company C, D, E, and F in the future. And now we have the blueprint to bring them into the fold.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's key because most companies, are acquiring or going through different mergers, so it's probably not a one-time thing. I know at least for Citrix, we've gone through multiple acquisitions, and I'm sure we will do even more acquisitions in the future. So it's nice that they have this architecture in place to just facilitate that and make it easier on both the end users as well as IT.
Right. I think thanks to Workspace, if the company B doesn't have Citrix, it's very short learning curve for the users to get in and have access to all their existing apps and new apps in one place.
Matt, that is exactly the scenario that we're talking about here, where Company A had all the Citrix, expertise. They had the staff. Company B had the requirement. Specifically, this is during, when the pandemic was breaking out. So the need was there. They needed to do something fast. Workspace was available, and we were able to plug them in quickly.
No,
Yeah, and before we run out of time, I just want to point out that Brian and I have a reference architecture out on TechZone, techzone.citrix.com. So for the full story, the full implementation of how this stuff fit together, you can take a look at that for more info.
awesome. Well, we want to thank you guys for being here. I think this is an awesome use case that a lot of our listeners will be able to relate to. And I think the last note, that I don't know if we really hammered on is that they were able to get access to not only virtual apps and desktops, but also SaaS applications, web applications. And so it doesn't really matter, right, where company A or company B are in terms of are they mostly SaaS? Are they on-prem? Are they cloud? With Workspace, you can really put all the resources together. So
Yeah, and with that, I'm not sure if we touched on, but we were able to do that with what you would consider zero trust network access, ZTNA. There was no VPN. There was nothing that the users had to configure and install on their endpoint device, setting up VPNs or scaling VPNs out. It's just none of that. So with secure workspace access and virtual apps and desktops, you're able to do that without doing the whole VPN configuration.
yeah, for sure. And I think the coolest thing is that, Dan, the three of us, Matt, Dan, and myself, we built these environments, but they're not production, right? They're not production scale. But Brian, your customer did this in production. This actually works. They have it up and running, and it's something that, we can attest to that is scalable and that, anyone can do. So again, thank you guys for coming to TechZone Live. This has been extremely insightful, and we really appreciate your time.
Thanks, guys.